So Raid and Mythic Plus testing have started on the Midnight Beta for Season 1. I kind of wanted to just make an unscripted video sort of talking about my thoughts on the raids, as well as my thoughts on how Devourer is doing in those raids. Not super focused on actual tuning too much per se, but I do want to point out some of the issues with tuning and how they can affect our rotation. I also wanted to talk about builds and, trinkets and things like that sort of people kind of flitter between. But starting with Chimaerus. Chimaerus is a cool boss. He's in a raid all by himself. And the big thing with this boss is there's I wouldn't say constant ads, but there's a lot of ads on this fight. You have a down group, you have an up group. The down group goes down, they kill the ads, and then those ads come up to the up group kills them, and then we're all happy. And then the boss flies in the air and does a strafing run that you can bait, sort of like Farok in Amirdrasil. And the cool thing about this boss is it does kind of lean a little bit towards a little bit more bursty kind of AoE builds, but this would purely be for ad damage. I cannot stress enough that would be for ad damage. And I've already thrown up the talent builds I'm using, that I was using for this, and just raid testing at large. And I just want to preface with the main reason I used Void Scarred so much was because a majority of the testing that was done that I'm aware of was with, that ranged Annihilator build, or maybe a melee-centered Annihilator build for single target. And I really wanted to sort of limit test Void Scar a little bit in seeing. Obviously, we know its single target damage is far below Annihilator, but I kind of wanted to see how its damage profile would work out on some of these fights. And there were definitely fights like Chimaerus that seemed a little bit more friendly to Void Scarred, but just for ad damage, not for a single target. But Chimaerus was cool. I really liked Chimaerus, even though we had a little bit of connection issues. We only had an hour with each boss, so at times there's just going to be, you just don't have a lot of time with every boss. So you kind of have to make the most of it in terms of talents and things like that. I was kind of flittering between long meta and short meta on this boss. And just kind of came to the conclusion that long meta is always going to be better in raid. Unless, extraneous circumstances barred. But long meta just plays a lot better in a raid where it's more consistent timings and things like that. But also just the haste is really, really nice, even if you're playing a spec like Void Scarred, where maybe you're not relying as much on like things like consume damage, at least, well, you are, because consume is doing a lot of damage, but not as much as like something like Annihilator is. Moving on to the Void Spire raid, with Imperator Averzian. This boss, like many first bosses, was really easy to understand and kind of get into, but it was also really cool. We were all really impressed with it during testing. The boss is basically tic-tac-toe. You were, killing a Voidwalker, and then you kill another Voidwalker, and then the last Voidwalker you leave alive is the one you actually fight anyway. But basically you're running to get 3 in a row, and then you can kill the boss. It's pretty simple, at least on heroic. Once again, I'm just running Void Scarred on this. There were times I might have swapped to a ranged Annihilator build for a couple pulls just to kind of see how it felt, but this was purely just for like a feely craft thing. My main focus was on Void Scarred, but ranged Annihilator feels great on these bosses. I had no expectations otherwise, because just ranged Annihilator is just good. And being able to not worry about melee mechanics is obviously, something that's really nice to have if you want on a boss, especially for, if you're the type of person that just doesn't want to play melee at all, that's really accessible to you. Moving on to Vorasius. To me, I think the consensus from my testing group was that we kind of didn't like this boss. It kind of feels like what Fractalus might have wanted to be, in the sense of, like, you have these walls and you're breaking them by killing ads on top of them, but there's also just this constant tank puddle that the tanks have to soak and it's in melee, and it takes up a large part of melee. And since I was playing Voice Guard, that was kind of inconvenient for me. It really isn't Voice Guard's fault; it's more just a melee problem. So that might be a fight where I'm just like, I'm just gonna throw caution to the wind and play a ranged Annihilator build just to get through it without having to deal with those mechanics. Which is definitely an advantage of the spec. And then moving on to Fallen King Salhadaar, familiar from the Manaforge Omega raid. Fallen King Salhadaar was pretty cool. He was pretty simple. It was mostly just kill orbs, take things out of the raid. Pretty simple boss, but that's kind of to be expected from the first 3 bosses of the raid. Because a big part of that is you want, especially in a 6 boss raid, you want those bosses to be puggable, especially if bosses like Chimaerus and the bosses in, March on Quel'Danas end up being these really hard bosses on Mythic. You need a few bosses in there that are just easy for people to do, or at least a challenge, obviously, for maybe guilds that aren't pushing CE, and they might clear half of a normal 8 boss raid on Mythic rather than using CE. But not too much to say about Salhadaar. I mean, it was a cool fight. I think I just played Ranged Annihilator on this, but I wouldn't see too many issues with playing melee Voice Guard on it either. Vaelgor Ezzorak. This fight is definitely where the difficulty ramps up for sure, and it's definitely a very tank dependent fight as well. Mostly, it feels like every mechanic is like, you're relying on your tank for this. For basically, if you have to soak something, your tank has to point it at you, and you have to not get tail swiped, so the tank has to have good positioning. Which is actually, I'm a really big fan of in reality, because I like when tanks have stuff to do. Almost every tank I've raided with, and I've tanked raids in the past where, the biggest complaint from them is that they just don't have anything to do. Honestly, didn't see a whole ton of this fight, but there's some kind of reminiscent of Raszageth stuff with the orbs that you have to kill, that you can interrupt, but it actually doesn't kill them, so you do have to AoE them. There might be some cool stacking stuff involved with that. And then moving on to Lightblinded Vanguard. This, to me, entirely just felt like Soul Hunters, but Paladin. Which is cool. I mean, it's a council fight, so you can kind of say that for a few of the council fights in the game. This is a fight that Voidsguard just felt really, really good on. And I tested with Voodoo's group, and he actually ended up swapping over to Voidsguard as well, just to test it out. And I think just in that 3-target cleave, and we also ended up taking Eradicate, and it just felt really strong. You're not going to be doing like this insane tunnel damage to one target, especially with Devourer's Bite not being very good. Like, there's some cool mechanics here where, maybe one will bubble, or one will have a big, like, all 3 of them have a big AoE mechanic, and, the Draenei one, you have to burn the shield down in time and interrupt them, and there's some cool mechanics at play there. I think eventually we got to a point where it was just, that same phase over and over. You're just rotating between the 3. It'll just be interesting to see how the health works out with that, and kind of how it would look. Or if you kill one, does the fight get harder and things like that. And then for our last boss of testing, Belo'ren, Child of Alar. This was a very, very, very cool fight. At the start of the fight, you basically get marked as a light or a void. And you're basically playing, not against, but you're interacting heavily with the other color. And, if a light person gets a soak, void people have to soak it with them, and vice versa. There's these orbs that kind of start coming at you through the walls that you have to soak with your respective color. And then these ads spawn that you kill, and they drop eggs, and if you don't kill the egg, that ad respawns, like the whole Phoenix mechanic that the Blood Elves are kind of known for. And then it has this kind of cool egg burn phase. And when you kill the egg in the burn phase, the boss will stop respawning. So, like, when you kill the boss, it just turns into an egg, and then you wait, I think it's a 30-second phase, where after that 30 seconds, the boss respawns unless the egg is killed. And then you'll do that a couple times before Enrage. But really just a cool boss. I know some of the top guilds were getting to the second boss in the raid. I unfortunately did not. But I heard they had good things to say about that boss as well. Moving on to Mythic Plus, and I'm going to put the Mythic Plus build I have been running on the screen. The Annihilator Mythic Plus build can kind of just be found, either on the Icy Veins guide or in my own written guide as well. And Mythic Plus feels good, barring some, and these are just things they're working on. They released some hotfix notes today talking about how they reduced some casters and things like that in Seed of the Triumvirate and Pit of Saron. But Devourer feels really, really good in Mythic Plus, especially once they fix the Reap rotational issues. And this is where something like Trinkets comes in, because I was running a 1 minute 30 unused Trinket that gave me a bunch of mastery, and I was running that with the Void Scarred build I put up. And a big thing with Devour Mythic Plus that I kind of found while using that minute 30 again is that your trinkets just aren't going to line up all the time. But when they do, if you're playing Void Scarred, you do a lot of AoE damage. Your single target's going to suffer as a result, but that's just because you're playing Void Scarred. It's not really a talent issue. Void Scarred just isn't as good as Annihilator. But the AoE is definitely, the gap is a lot smaller than we may have initially thought. But I would still run 2 passive trinkets even if you're playing Void Scarred, simply due to the fact that it's not always going to line up, especially if you're playing short meta like I was in Mythic Plus. But talking specifically about dungeons, Pit of Saron, this is probably my favorite dungeon of the 4 that are the 4 old dungeons that are either coming back, or in Pit of Saron's case, and I guess technically Skyreach's case, are new Mythic Plus dungeons. Pit of Saron, I really liked. The count was pretty atrocious. In terms of just, the dungeon has way too much trash that you need to kill in it, and I know they just changed it today where, you need 5% less trash or something. But the bosses, I liked the bosses, especially the last boss. It feels definitely like they're reiterating on some old bosses that are, not just from the dungeons that are coming back, but the dungeons, in years past. And then moving on to Skyreach. Skyreach's problem is that you're very confined. The whole dungeon is just very small in width. And especially if you're playing melee Devour, that can get a little tricky, especially on the first boss where, if you hit a wind wall, you die, or if you fall off, you die. And the kill gate on that is very short. You really don't have a lot of room to do a clutch, vengeful retreat back onto the platform or anything. But as a dungeon, I thought it was fine. The Golem second boss doesn't really do much, really at all. But otherwise, I think it's a solid dungeon. And you can still do some decently sized pulls in there. So, it's not Algeth'ar level, but... moving on to Seed of the Triumvirate. Seed of the Triumvirate probably has my least favorite trash in the entire dungeon pool so far, at least of the 4 that we have. The trash in this dungeon is just genuinely really, really bad. I know they made changes again today, so I'll have to test that out, but at least before... in the last couple days since Mythic Plus testing has been live, the trash in here is just super deadly, and you can't really do big pulls. Can't really do big pulls a lot of the time. But the bosses are good. I like the bosses, except for in the first boss. If he spawns slimes after he dies and he eats them, it still puts this massive dawn on you, even though the boss is dead. So just watch out for that if that bug does not get fixed. But the bosses are good. The Huntmaster guy and the 2 pets that he has are a good cleave fight. Especially for Void Scar, but you'll take advantage even if you're playing Annihilator. And then moving on to Algeth'ar Academy. Algeth'ar, everyone knows from Dragonflight that Algeth'ar was the big AoE blast dungeon. So when you're doing, basically every part of this dungeon has big pulls in it, which is really fun. And the bosses are basically the only boss that I think got changes really was the bird, and the bird is just easier now. So I think Algeth'ar is definitely looking to, barring, we haven't seen the 4 other Mythic Plus dungeons yet as tested, but Algeth'ar is definitely looking to be the, you know, oh, let's just run a quick Algeth'ar for my vault kind of key. Um, but overall, kind of my closing thoughts so far in testing as Devourer, I think that we're in a really good spot, and I encourage people not to doom because we're gonna get tuning still, and things like Reap can get fixed, and things like Devour being 40% of our single target damage. Those things can get fixed, and I was seeing last night that actually in Sims it's like it's a damage gain to not unless you're gonna get at least 4 collapsing stars, it's a damage gain to just not press it at all and things like that. And it's just, oh my goodness. But I think part of that's just new spec growing pains, and I think part of that is just I think it's just Blizzard needs to listen a little bit more to feedback, and hopefully we can get some changes that are a little beyond tuning. Like the hunt is still really boring, and I kind of made a video about that already. But there's just talents that need to get changed. Like Reap's cooldown getting reduced by haste. Like at that point, I'm just gonna take our second Reap charge if I even take it at all. Especially with Moment of Craving resetting a charge of Reap, But I think for now, I think that's a really good compilation of my thoughts, both on the raids so far and Mythic Plus. We're in a really good spot. Please, please, please test out builds you think are fun and builds that you want to see tested. I encourage you to look at resources like the Fellhammer and the Devourer FAQ and things like that. But it's also really important, especially during beta, to make your own builds and say, "Hey, guys, I think this is working." And link a log of it and see, oh yeah, maybe that's a combo that we can start using and put in the APL and things like that. But for now, I think that's going to be my thoughts on Devourer so far. But I will likely be streaming any future Mythic Plus testing that I do going forward.